these alternative networks also tend to create a bit of an echo chamber. So if there is a threat to be made, they may feel like that sort of that domain, that alternative tech location is a safer place to share those sort of indications and thoughts and feelings.
Neil, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Rob. Always a pleasure. And first and foremost, thank you very much for giving me the time to get a cup of tea before starting. Very important for this part of the conversation.
Now, Neil, the reason why I wanted to have you back on the show was you recently gave a great presentation on the rise of a lot of these alternative social networks and the risk that they're presenting to corporate security teams. And I thought that presentation was really, really interesting. So I wanted to get you back on the show to talk about that. Let's dive right into that. Why should OSINT analysts and corporate security teams be paying attention to these alt-tech social networks and these online communities?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's obviously, a hot topic at the moment, and it, the topic sort of ebbs and flows, and for good reason. It pops up in the media from time to time, and then disappears again, a bit like some of these networks. So, the big why here is they are a component of the threat landscape, realistically, and if you're not fully collecting and fully understanding of what that online threat landscape looks like, then you're missing a piece of the puzzle. So what you end up finding in these areas are, threats, physical threats, cyber threats, doxing, and equally misinformation campaigns. It is a treasure trove of threat intelligence, but equally, with all the threats, there's also some opportunities. So, again, I think if you're not actively looking to explore and collect from and have them as part of your intelligence picture, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Really, really interesting. Let's take a step back, I guess, maybe for people that haven't heard this term before, because I know it's going to be the title of the show. Why don't we just define for new listeners what exactly are alt-tech social networks?
Yeah, and it's a fairly loose definition. In fairness, I don't think the Oxford Dictionary or alternative has ever sat down and gone, this is exactly what defines alternate social networks. So realistically, when we look at it, and especially in the world of SOCMINT, so social media intelligence, these are the platforms that have appeared seemingly overnight, even though actually some of them have been around for a while, but they're the non-traditional platforms. So they're not the Twitters of the world, they are not the Facebooks of the world, and Meta collectively, so Instagram included in that. They're not the LinkedIns of the world. They are more the lines of Gab, which is probably one of the better known in those alternate social networks. Chan boards is another big one. Again, one that's not been that is certainly not new, but has certainly come to prominence for all the wrong reasons, which I'm sure we can get into later. Over the years and ebbs and flows. Parler, if you go back to the 2020 US election, Parler became incredibly prominent overnight, and actually fast forward, almost 3 years, I suppose, at this stage. That platform has more or less ceased to exist, actually. So it went from being sort of the number one downloaded app in the App Store, certainly social media network in the App Store in 2020, to being actually non-existent. And in April this year was acquired by the Starboard Group. So yeah, what defines realistically these alternative social networks is they're not part of that core sort of traditional group that have been around for years, and have a significant user base. These alternative social sites and networks tend to be much smaller in many instances, user bases. There's probably a couple of exceptions to that, and tend to be fairly well grouped in the sort of people that will frequent and utilize the social media. And again, they seem to ebb and flow in popularity depending on what's going on in the social media space.
Gotcha. So it's kind of a catch-all term for anything that's not the big main platforms, your Facebooks, your Reddits, your LinkedIns, and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, and I will actually say that sometimes at Liferaft we group together the alternative and the emerging, because emerging, I would list things like TikTok in emerging, because actually TikTok's not been around for that long in the grand scheme of things, and but it has a user base of 1 billion people, billion users, billion monthly users. So it is, again, people kind of view it as one, certainly these days, is one of the mainstream platforms, but it is a relatively new and emerging social media channel in the grand scheme of things. I wouldn't group that into the alternative social media. It is definitely in the mainstream, but it is certainly an emerging, or has emerged at this stage, social media platform.
I guess it'd be fair to like compare it to sometimes like minor league baseball players. They can be promoted to the major league. Some of, like when I started at Liferaft, some of these alt tech sites that we were talking about, like TikTok, was considered alt tech at the time.
Yeah.
Now I definitely consider that, if you're talking to any Gen Zer, that's a
Yeah.
mainstream platform now, no doubt
Yeah,
about it.
absolutely, and certainly some of the alternative networks would like to follow some of that trajectory. I think due to the nature of the demographic that they tend to target themselves towards, some of these alternate networks, that they're constrained, in all honesty, by the sort of growth they can have. But again, even though they're a smaller subset of the social landscape, doesn't mean that they're not a very, very useful tool and source within social media intelligence world.
Well, I included there with one of the keywords that you mentioned with was who inhabits these communities. And I kind of want to dive in a bit more into that. So can you tell me a little bit about the demographics that might inhabit an alt tech website versus the user base for more mainstream platforms?
Yeah, I mean, certainly mainstream tends to be every person that might be out there. So, I mean, you and I, am sure, to a certain extent, have a presence. How active or not we are there, but certainly in social media. I mean, we're both of the similar generations. I'm sure we have Facebook accounts somewhere out there, probably going back further, MySpace accounts. But very, very mainstream. That would be sort of the traditional social media. Not again tied to specific demographics, although certainly age and potentially location comes into a driver of the traditional social media platforms. So we discussed TikTok tends to be the younger generations. Facebook tends to be the older generations. Speaking myself here, and Twitter, bit more ubiquitous, but again tends to be a little bit of an older generational tool, but then can be a really useful sort of newsfeed across the board. When you're looking at the alternate space, they tend to be populated by I'm going to say disenfranchised users of mainstream social media networks. So those people that are unhappy with either some of the policies or maybe political stance of those social media providers, especially, and I'm sure we get into some of this, especially sort of the 2020 election, sort of the stance that providers like Twitter and Facebook took as far as policies and terms of use for their networks. That certainly for many in the social media domain or social media users, they saw some of that approach to oversight as being overreaching and actually constraining freedom of speech, etc. So as a result, people have moved to alternative networks that, in many instances, will promote freedom of speech, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But there's always, this fine line. And it's one that certainly the mainstream networks tend to struggle with all the time. There is a fine line between, freedom of speech and inciting acts of violence or inciting hate speech, etc. So it's certainly a tricky balance for both alternative and mainstream channels to sort of tread and march that thin line, if you will. But that tends to be the sort of groups that find themselves to these alternate social networks, is those that don't agree or indeed have been deplatformed by those mainstream groups, and as a result, you end up with a lot of similar sort of like-minded individuals populating these alternative social channels.
Yeah, that's kind of been my impression when I've kind of visited some of these communities. It really just depends on the site, I suppose, too. It's
Yeah,
like some of them, it's could be far right, could be far left,
yeah.
could be privacy activists. It kind of depends on the site, and so kind of broad strokes doesn't always work when you're trying to describe all of alternative tech.
Absolutely, yeah, and you hit a really good point. We've sort of touched on I would say some of the more right leaning, left leaning. Certainly, when you look at platforms like Mastodon and the decentralization approach that the Mastodon has, you're absolutely right. That is more around privacy and what people are doing with the data, et cetera, et cetera. And again, having a place that is relatively self-policing as far as the sort of content that can be posted there. But again, that comes by its very nature with pros and cons of the sort of content that's posted there.
I want to push back and challenge you a little bit on why we should be monitoring these sites. So, one of the first objections I could think of is, a lot of these communities are pretty small, they're pretty obscure. They might only have a few thousand users or tens of thousands of users. And, just in terms of the amount of activity that are going on, I know from the presentation I saw some of the sites that you were mentioning, they might only have like 100,000 users, which is
Yeah.
small potatoes compared to, a Facebook or a Reddit or something like that. So with given the small user base some of these communities might have, what would be the reason to pay attention to them at all versus the more mainstream platforms?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. So just because it's a small user base doesn't mean that there's not content of interest there. Any content posted into the online domain, into the digital domain, potentially is of use. Again, it could be malicious threats that are being posted in there. Just because it's a malicious threat in a alternative network doesn't make it any less malicious than if it's in a mainstream network. These alternative networks also tend to create a bit of an echo chamber, which is a really interesting dynamic that these alternative social networks drive, and so it almost creates a much safer space for people to, I suppose, share in many instances what some of these actors, how they really want to portray themselves. So if there is a threat to be made, they may feel like that sort of that domain, that alternative tech location is a safer place to share those sort of indications and thoughts and feelings with like-minded individuals. And again, that means that potentially before it manifests itself into either a mainstream network or into a real threat, that sphere and that area of interest, those alternate tech social, can be used as a very early warning or indicator that there is something awry in that digital space that might be coming over the horizon, if you will, towards these organizations. So those are a couple of good reasons. Another one is it's interesting how some of the narratives and sort of some of the misinformation campaigns tend to migrate their ways from the smaller depths of the alternate social networks into some of the mainstream social. And I know sort of, not too long ago, you put out a blog around misinformation and the Wayfair, QAnon theories, etc. So those QAnon conspiracies and the mantra behind them, especially when targeting the likes of Wayfair, they started in Chan boards. Like, Chan boards are the origin of the QAnon theories in many instances, and then they've sort of started to migrate their way across into mainstream media, into platforms like Facebook, etc., etc. And again, sort of being able to detect those early warnings. Really at their genesis, if you can, that enables you to get ahead of it, plan, mitigate if you can, and maybe if you can't stop the wave coming, you can at least put up enough of a mitigation and plan for what might be coming, so you can mitigate that impact.
Well, that's a really interesting point that you just made about the misinformation. So With like the Wayfair example, if you're just coming up and detecting this stuff once it's on Facebook or Reddit or whatever, you've kind of missed the boat.
It's too
Where
late.
you're you're messing a couple of hours or maybe a few days to respond. Where if you were watching this, like you said, at the genesis on these alt tech channels, you can have a lot more time to prepare for the proper response.
Absolutely. Yeah. Time is crucial with so many things in the security world. And brand protection is a big piece of, I'm going to say the corporate security scope these days. It's becoming more and more a piece of the corporate security scope. That sort of overlap between marketing and corporate security working as partners, because frankly, a threat to an organization's brand can have far-reaching implications financially, from a physical security perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So the two sort of need to work hand in glove, very much like the physical security team, the cybersecurity team these days. A lot of moving parts that involve, that need some interlinked workflows, et cetera.
Right. And I'm just bringing it back to physical threats. I know we had an unfortunate shooting recently in Texas, and some
Yeah.
of our colleagues were talking about how a lot of this stuff was being posted on, I think it was a site like a Russian alt tech site,
Yeah. Okay.ru.
OK.ru. Yeah.
Yep.
And like same kind of thing. Like if you're watching the mainstream sites, great, you'll get lots of intel there. But in this particular example, a guy like him who was this not neo-Nazi white supremacist guy from the early media reports, uh, that's all getting kicked off the mainstream sites pretty quick. So a
Yep.
lot of these bad actors are boom, these more obscure communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, there is a long history, especially in the likes of Chan boards, where, especially white supremacists have posted manifestos before undertaking violent events. Even you go back to Gab again. Gab sort of. You look at Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. Manifestos were posted into Gab prior to that event. So you need to be looking at the right places to pick up those early warnings. Unfortunately, history repeats itself, another tragic example of why this is an important space to be monitoring.
I want to take some practical takeaways now for someone who's maybe been hearing about this and they want to start taking action to protect their business or their organization. For someone who's maybe just starting to dip their toes, learning more about alt tech, and want to start monitoring these platforms, where would you suggest that they get started?
Yeah, I think if you look at sort of some foundational knowledge, if you go back to actually TechCrunch is a really good resource for learning about some of these emerging social networks. So it's a great tech centric publication in general. So it's a really good place to start. Also, and sort of I'll tip my cap again to the good folks at Bellingcat. So they have a great Discord server, broadly looking at OSINT, but they have some, sort of far right extremism elements of that, and some left wing extremism in general, actually, subsets of their Discord server, which touches on some of this. And then beyond that, they've got sort of some best practices sections and a little bit of tradecraft, etc. Some tools they've got listed in there. So I think that's some really good foundational knowledge to learn sort of about the subject matter when it comes to the actual emerging alternative social sites in general or sources, and then also some of the tradecraft around it and best practices. And I think beyond that, and certainly the Bellingcat Discord server will talk to some of these. Good OSINT best practices are always worth following in general. So what I mean by that is, good investigative hygiene. So that is using a laptop that is a safe laptop in the sense that it's not connected to any other corporate networks, and it is a laptop that you can go to some of these sites in a safe kind of fashion. So, in the sense that you're not going to download and infect the rest of your corporate network if you click on the wrong link. Equally, sort of having that laptop without any of your usual usernames and passwords, etc. It's a dedicated laptop for OSINT research. That is certainly part of best practices. Some of these sites, and again, I'll come back to Chan boards. Bit of a history of having some very very concerning material posted in there, and as a result of that, if you're just sort of moving around, you could come across some very unpleasant artifacts in those domains. So yeah, having the right sort of background knowledge to go and undertake some of these investigations, but also then having the right tools to go and effectively undertake these investigations and research, doing it in a safe manner. So again, sort of a dedicated laptop, not connected to the network. Some people use virtual machines. Some people, use secure browsing tools like Authenticate's Solo browser. Another prime example of doing that in a secure domain. It's a tool that's built for really OSINT research in the cyber domain and generally in the online space. So lots of tools out there that you can use. I think it's making sure before you do anything, just making sure your ducks are in a row as far as baseline knowledge. What am I going to search for? What do I want to go and research? And how to do it safely and effectively.
Really good resources here. I'll be sure to include all the links to all of them in the show notes for this episode, so everyone can check them out if they want to. In terms of, you've mentioned a lot of great, interesting platforms throughout the course of this episode. Are there any in particular that are on your radar screen, new emerging platforms that you see growing that analysts should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting one of that, actually, I mean, as a result of the unfortunate events yesterday, 2 days ago, so OK.ru is certainly prominent, but that's another one of those examples that's actually been around for a while. We have a collection of it in our platform. But Blue Sky is an interesting one. So you've got sort of, Jack Dorsey starting to recreate a Twitter competitor. And it's always interesting with these with these emerging social channels, in the sense that, especially from an OSINT perspective, there is an element of sort of getting in there early to see what's there, but also, making sure they're sort of reaching critical mass to a certain extent to start to get more value. I know we touched on, that there is value in even some of these smaller sites, but if you're going to spend sort of time and effort doing research in these locations, things like Blue Sky is still emerging. So, at what point does it start to really have some deep value to it? So there is a bit of a tipping point for some of these. And then, Jack Dorsey, for the most part, knows what he's doing. So, you would expect that to potentially persist. But if you go back to the Parler example 3 years later, and it's off the map. So, it'll be interesting to see where that one goes next.
Yeah, well, like you've mentioned, it's an emerging ecosystem and things are changing all the time, right? One day, like you mentioned, Parler, it's surging, everyone's joining it. The next day, it's booted off all the app stores, it's gone. And that's been the whole history since I've joined Liferaft. It's like, oh, there was this platform we were talking about 2 years ago that was everyone was going to. Now it's in the dustbin of the internet history, right? So it's just constantly changing. And yeah, like just like you said, keeping an eye on, a platform might not be relevant today, but a couple months from now, that exponential growth curve kicks in.
Yeah.
Now you got to be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in those those early stages, it's always worth keeping tabs on, worth keeping an eye on to see where it might go and what sort of content might be there.
All right, Neil, we're coming up on all the time that I promised to take from you today. How do you see, just to wrap up, how do you see this space evolving over the next couple of years?
Yeah, if you fast forward in a couple of years, I mean, I don't see the general trend changing. I mean you look at sort of yeah, we've spoken a lot about 2020, but then if you fast forward, Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, so created another sort of exodus of users from Twitter to some of the emerging platforms, and then arguably back again. So I think to answer your question directly, I see the landscape continuing to be more fragmented, and I see the ebb and flow of users for whatever reasons, be it concerns about the privacy, concerns about enforcement policies, etc., concerns about usability. Quite frankly, sometimes the social media platforms don't meet their users' needs, so therefore something else will come up. Just usual sort of market driven forces. So yeah, certainly ebb and flow and fragmentation of the social media landscape. Decentralization is a big topic for some of these emerging social platforms. So I certainly see that is a trend that we will see moving forward.
All right. And Neil, how can people reach out if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to visit the Liferaft website, but also my LinkedIn profile. We can leave a link to that in the show notes. And yeah, I'm always here to have people connect if they want to ask questions about some of the work that we do, about some of the work that I do specifically. Yeah, drop me a DM on LinkedIn, and we go from there.
All right. Neil, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.